Hello everybody and welcome back to the next video in our series where we're looking at Auto 5s. These are the shotguns that the Auto 5 inspired, the guns that were derived from it. Essentially the history of autoloading shotguns told through the lens of those long recoil examples like we have here today. In specific, today we're looking at the Remington 1148. This was Remington's answer to the Winchester Model 40. Of course, the Winchester Model 40 came just before World War II, and due to its production issues, plus the fact that the war had kicked off, it was pretty much done and over by the end of World War II. However, the Winchester Model 40 represented a very forward-thinking way of looking at automatic shotguns. The public had had a couple of complaints about the Auto 5, and a couple of these complaints were legitimate. A couple of them were a little bit, in my opinion, made up. But they really came down to cost and complexity of disassembly, and really the cost of just buying one in the first place. And the other big complaint was the looks of the Auto 5. These days we look at the Auto 5 and go, wow, classic shotgun looks great. Back in the day, people didn't like the fact that it had a humpback receiver. They didn't like the screws on the outside of the receiver. To them, that either made it look something between cheap or antiquated. So Winchester was really early to the game with making and entering into production, albeit for a short time, a very modernized looking Auto 5. It didn't really solve the cost. The Model 40 was expensive. It didn't really solve the complexity. It was still pretty hard to take apart, only slightly easier to get the bolt out of than an actual Auto 5, but it definitely streamlined it and made it look better. Now, to set the stage, there after World War II, Remington had been running the autoloading shotgun market both prior and after World War II. And the autoloading shotgun market was huge in the United States, but pump-action shotguns still represented a very large part of the market. Of course, autoloading shotguns were an ever-growing piece of that market as people got comfortable with autoloading shotguns are reliable, easier to use. In some cases, they're more reliable and easier to use than pump actions, albeit just a little bit more expensive. But Winchester still really owned the pump-action shotgun game, mostly with the Model 12. Especially in period writing, gun writers will eulogize the Model 12 as being the perfect pump-action shotgun, the perfect shotgun outright. They were really big fan, really popular gun at the time, and this is what Remington had to contend with. They were really running the autoloading shotgun game with the Model 11 anyway. Of course, Browning was having imports of the Auto 5 from Belgium, but the Model 11 was really holding its own in sales number at this point with the Auto 5. And that made Remington a lot of money. Remington pump-action offerings at these times couldn't come close to competing with the Model 12 pump-action from Winchester, but Winchester didn't have an autoloading shotgun whatsoever by the end of World War II. And Remington really seized the opportunity to bring the autoloading shotgun, bring the Auto 5's action into the future, and not just into the future by a little. Whether Remington knew it or not, they were very, very forward-looking with the 1148. As we go into the gun, we'll look at more of the things that I'm about to discuss, but just to sort of preface it so it's in your mind and you're thinking about it, Remington had a couple of goals, right? Those three big goals. More streamlined, well, that's obvious. The gun is more streamlined than an Auto 5. Tick that box. They wanted to make the gun cheaper. Now, in the end, Remington would make the gun cheaper for them, and they'd sell this gun for what a Model 11 had previously sold for. And Remington was probably, in their cost in manufacturing these was probably about half of what it was for Model 11s. So Remington was making a lot of money. Remington made the gun cheaper. They just didn't sell it to you for any cheaper, which cold-hearted capitalists that they were, made Remington a lot of money and set the stage for them to continue dominating the autoloading shotgun market for years to come. Now, certainly cheaper, right? We can check that box. But the third box, and we'll take this gun not detail stripped, but pretty far apart just to show you guys that in the span of narrating this video, I can get this gun apart to its sub-assemblies, and it won't take me very long at all. Compared to whenever you do that with an Auto 5, it would take a really long time, right? An Auto 5 would take it'd be an hour-long video just to take the gun apart that I can do in maybe 20 minutes here. Much simplified compared to the Auto 5. And that was something that the market clamored for. The final thing that the market sometimes complained about on the complexity front was having to switch around the friction rings in the Auto 5. Of course, we understand in retrospect that really that's just it's a thing for people that don't have to change friction rings. It's something that they'll market about, like a Winchester claimed with the 1911 shotgun. We looked at it before, where you have to cock the barrel. It didn't have friction rings at all, so you don't have to adjust the friction rings. What's the downside? It kicks really, really hard. Not very comfortable to shoot. So we understand that having an adjustable friction ring is a benefit. That's not a drawback. It's actually a really good thing that you're able to change the friction rings. In fact, I think a lot of shotguns these days, even inertia guns could have friction systems in them to smooth out that recoil a little bit some if they so desired. But point being, Remington took heed of that advice anyway, and they did simplify the recoil system. We'll look at that a little bit more later once we get under the hood. Finally, Remington did something that no big company had really done so far. They introduced sub-gauge automatics. We have a 410 1148 here. They also introduced a 28 gauge. If my memory serves correctly, the Remington 1148 didn't actually come out till 1949, and that was in 12, 16, and 20. 28 gauge comes out the next year, 1950, and then the 410 gauge comes out in 1951. But some of the guns Remington says were manufactured in 1950. The dates get a little bit jumbled there, but Remington did sort of roll out, if you will, in stages, the different versions of the 1148. Now, one thing that the 1148 didn't address, and I just want to get this out of the way from the beginning, is it didn't make the gun any lighter. We will look at other guns that were pretty contemporaneous with the 1148 that did manage to make this system quite a bit lighter, but the 1148 still weighs in at your usual 7.5, 8 pounds that an all-steel shotgun just tends to weigh. So they did not cut much weight from this thing compared to the Auto 5, though they had the opportunity to do so, and this was probably a consideration of the fact that the lighter you make it, the heavier the felt recoil will be, and they're trying to balance out having a non-adjustable recoil system that just tends to kick harder than a adjustable recoil system. So we will set our 410 gauge to the side. We will do more shooting with it, and we'll talk about the one mechanical difference it has from the 12 gauge gun later, once we've had the 12 gauge gun taken apart and put back together. Now, going over the last couple of external differences we see here on our 12 gauge gun, of course we've got wood that is, to the feel is a little bit lower quality. The checkering's lower quality. I don't think this gun has been revarnished, but I think the Forend has been sanded at some point lightly. They didn't get rid of all the checkering, but I have held examples of new old stock you never mounted to a gun furniture for these. The checkering just doesn't feel good. It's not very sharp, and if you told me that it was pressed in, because of course pressed in, or even these days lasered in is the way that it's done cheap. But if you told me this checkering was just pressed in by something that was this shape of this checkering and they just pressed it, I'd believe it. I don't know that this checkering feels very cut to me anyway. But certainly Remington was making a cheaper shotgun here. And probably the easiest example of that we'll see as we go inside of the gun is they made use of technologies that were developed during World War II. Now, as far as I can tell, this shotgun, the 1148, was the first time that a commercial firearm is going to integrate sort of the two big manufacturing technologies that got perfected. I want to say perfected in World War II. Obviously more development still happened, but steel stamping and especially casting, but especially with aluminum. Two technologies that were focused on in World War II. Aluminum not so much for arms development per se, but certainly casting was developed more as an arms manufacturing technology in World War II. But Remington would make use of aluminum parts and stamped parts throughout this shotgun to bring the manufacturing costs down. This certainly was effective, and the way that they pulled these off, these days people think of stamping and casting as it's made cheaper, and that's true, it is made cheaper, but cheaper doesn't necessarily mean bad. And this is a recurring debate that has gone on in the gun space since probably even before the 1148, but it happened around the time of the 1148 too, where Browning would start bragging about the fact that we've got no stamped parts in our shotgun. Other shotgun manufacturers that did have stamped parts in their shotgun would say we've got no stamped parts, they just lie about it. Others would brag about the fact we've got no alloys in our shotgun, despite the fact that they did have alloys, and even though they were saying no aluminum alloys, they'd have materials that were inferior to aluminum alloys in their shotgun in their attempt to avoid using aluminum in the first place. So it's certainly a thing that's gone on for a long time, but I think most recently, at least most memorably in recent memory, is Glocks versus 1911s, right? Where Glocks are made out of an inferior material. Polymer is not as good as steel, but it has advantages in being inferior. And that debate went on around this too, because of course the stamped parts in this gun save weight compared to their equivalent milled parts in the Auto 5. So there's a weight savings, just like with the Glock. It's just that these feel worse, they're a little bit more clunky, rough around the edges, it's not as nice feeling, doesn't feel as premium, if you will. And admittedly, if you look at the historical prices for these guns, the 1148 sold for $200 less in today's money than an Auto 5, but Auto 5s cost about $1,500 to $1,800 in today's money. And when you think about it, $100 or $200 more to get an Auto 5, I'm surprised that the 1148 ever sold as well as it did. And I think that goes to show, A, how much people didn't like the humpbacked appearance, where just making the shotgun look more streamlined would make people pay almost as much for a shotgun that has substantial cost savings efforts taken to in its undertaking, but I guess it really goes to show, right, that Remington was dominating the marketing game. People wanted to buy a Remington if you wanted to buy an automatic, even if that Remington was going to be overpriced compared to what it cost Remington to make it. Not to say that these guns are overpriced bad, just when they were sold, they were very expensive for what you were getting compared to what Remington put into them. Not that they're cheap, just that they're strong, rugged, durable, reliable guns. Just whenever you pick one up, it doesn't feel like an Auto 5 at all. Everything's a little bit more gritty, everything's a little bit more rough around the edges. As we take apart the gun, we'll be able to see some more of that. Disassembly starts, like we've become very used to at this point, with a threaded magazine tube cap. There we go. Really quick on this cap, Remington did opt to machine the entire thing. Later we'll see versions of this cap, not for an 1148, but for other long recoil shotguns that have magazine caps. We'll see other versions of these that they opted to stamp some of the features on this. So that's one area Remington still could have saved money, but I guess they just didn't think to. Here's our forend. First thing you'll notice when you pick up an 1148 forend, it feels like it's made out of metal. And that's because a lot of it is. It's got a metal reinforcing buttress up front, and it's metal reinforcement lined all the way down the middle. This was almost certainly to address the fact that forends would split on Model 11s or Auto 5s, especially if you didn't adjust the friction rings right. And that is really annoying to have to deal with. Even the thought of your forend splitting becomes psychologically terrifying, especially if you had a forend split while you're shooting it. It's just no fun. And so this is something that Remington really sought to solve here. And it seems like they did a good job of solving it, where if you look for 1148s for sale, you will not find many that have split forends. It's very uncommon to see. And even if you did manage to split one of these forends, you could glue it back together and it would hold, because the wood isn't really structural here. As far as what keeps, what a forend's doing, right? It's this metal buttress has to be held to the receiver, and this cap is just going to do that. The metal buttress to the steel liner, the wood's more or less just there for you to hold. So much improved there. Big kudos to Remington, because this is one of my favorite long recoil shotgun forend designs. Not the most comfortable. Checkering's not that great. The metal reinforcement is pretty slick. That's it solves that worry pretty much entirely. Set our cap to the side there. Again, I'd mentioned that Remington simplified the friction system. The way that they did this, in fact, the way they did this wasn't present on the very early 1148s. They used more of a Browning style system still. But the way Remington did this is pretty clever. So you'll note our friction system is made up of different parts now. We no longer have a regular control ring. We no longer have a tensioning ring. Instead, we have a friction piece that sits inside of a recess on the barrel. The recess on the barrel has some taper to it. So if you push this ring in there, it will push, will smush the ring down. I'm just pushing in here. So just pushing in, the ring does pinch because there's a bevel on the inside of there. And of course, as this ring pinches down on the magazine tube, it will slow the recoiling assembly. However, I think really the magic or self-adjustingness comes in on the other end. Of course, we don't have a regular control ring. We have this big steel cylinder on the end of a flat spring wire spring. Now, there's a bevel in the cylinder, but it is an extremely gradual taper. This is very, very gradual compared to on the Browning friction rings, the angle of it's pretty much 90 degrees where it meets. Whereas on this, I'd estimate it. I mean, it's got to be like maybe even a 30-degree taper. It's a very, very steep taper on here. The advantage of such a steep taper is your cone here can push onto your friction ring and close it up more or less depending on how far it's pushed on. I intuit the way that this system works is you more or less have a fixed braking force whenever this ring comes all the way on. So whenever your cone here comes all the way onto the friction piece, it will bottom out against the barrel. Like so, they'll bottom out together. But whenever it's sort of just resting, right, it won't envelop any of that ring at all. And the ring is pretty good at pushing this cone back off of it. So I assume the way this works is, right, just at your moment of highest, right, if it's light or heavy loads, right after the gun fires, these rings will come together and touch, and you'll have very high braking force. But as the system gets slowed down, as you have less velocity here, this heavy metal cylinder will begin to push its way off of the friction ring as you have less velocity in the system total. So as this is being pushed less, because this ring is pushing back against the cylinder, my intuition is they separate themselves as you're firing. Now, this does get us to a discussion, right? You can shoot an Auto 5 set up for light loads with heavy loads and it will cycle. It will just have pretty harsh recoil. Now, this system, as it stands, right? This system will shoot light loads, right? It just does it. This system will also shoot heavy loads. When this system shoots heavy loads, it is smoother than an Auto 5 set up for light loads shooting heavy loads. Because this gun also shoots light loads, that tells me there is some amount of self-adjusting and some amount of self-compensation that happens with this. However, the amount of that compensation that happens is not as good as you get in the adjustable Auto 5, because an Auto 5 set up for heavy loads cycles smoother than this thing shooting heavy loads. So just to run you guys through that one more time in case that was unclear. This shotgun is self-adjusting. There is some amount of adjustment happens because it will do light loads and it will do heavy loads softer than an Auto 5 set up for light loads shooting heavy loads. However, an Auto 5 set up properly for heavy loads is substantially smoother than this. This thing is still pretty rough with heavy loads, don't get me wrong, but this self-adjusting system does do something. But that's more or less that system. The two cones sort of oppose each other here. It's certainly novel, and it addresses, right, a big complaint, a big limitation, if you will, of the Auto 5, where people didn't like to have to swap rings around. Well, you don't have to do it anymore with Remington's new Wonder shotgun. All right, next up, we'll get to our trigger group here. If you've ever taken Auto 5 apart, you'll know that if somebody pulled out these three tools and said, I'm going to take the trigger group out, you'd look at them and laugh because an Auto 5 does not come apart so easily. Meanwhile, Remington absolutely solved the big problem of the Auto 5 of how hard it is to take apart. Just to give you guys an idea, with an Auto 5, there's like 8 screws that have to come out in order to get the trigger group off the gun. Maybe not 8. I think you can do it with 4, 6. You have to do 6 screws, I think. Meanwhile here, 2 pins, and then you get your trigger group out of the gun. These pins are sort of regular. Although I do want to mention, of course, that the 1148 was massively influential when it comes to later shotgun development. This trigger group, we'll get into details, was absolutely no exception to that, but the receiver that Remington designed here would end up becoming effectively the same receiver they'd use in the Remington 58, which was their first gas-operated gun. And that would mature to become the Remington 1100. It would also become the Remington 870. And if I get my dates correct, I think it was the 1148, then it was the 870, then it was the 58, and then it was the 1100. But this receiver would become the backbone of the next 50, 60 years of Remington's shotgun manufacture. And of course, there's slightly different cuts, right? In order for it to be a pump action or a gas-operated shotgun, there were different cuts in the receiver. But the general receiver they made here was highly universal in that regard, and that is very cool. Additionally, very universal was the trigger group. This trigger group wouldn't just be copied by Remington. A lot of other manufacturers would do the same basic thing. And really what Remington pulled off here is to make it fully modular. So if you're familiar with the Auto 5, it's fairly modular. You have your fire control components are all on the trigger group, but you don't have your carrier on the fire control group. Integrating the carrier into the fire control group is really, really cool. Additionally, Remington got rid of the flat springs, right? It's all compression spring driven, or compression springs that are hiding underneath plungers, but they are still compression springs. So they've simplified that aspect compared to the Auto 5 as well. It's all now easily mass manufacturable springs. Of course, the problem with flat springs is they're not nearly as manufacturable, and heat treating them becomes a little bit of a mess, but massively improved there. The entire black part of this trigger group is cast aluminum. In fact, the casting mark says Alcoa, a company that would later make AR-15 uppers and lowers, which is sort of funny. But there's your trigger group. It's just cast aluminum, very simple. The trigger component parts itself, a lot of 2D stamped shapes. The carrier, even like we talked about earlier, a stamped shape. This is pretty revolutionary compared to the Auto 5 or the Model 40, the Remington 1911. The shotguns we've looked at so far, that's a big milled piece of metal on those. Really simple stamped piece of metal here. The hammer, the sear, the trigger, 2D shapes that could be punched. I mean, they're thin enough steel, they could have been punched out. It wouldn't be too surprised if these were just punched out by a metal brake die machine that's just set to cut these parts out. The rest of the parts, very simple stamped pieces. To give you guys an idea of how the trigger group works, because it is radically different than the Auto 5, I guess I want that to be a theme of this video, is this is an evolution of the Auto 5, but it's pretty much completely departed, completely redesigned compared to the Auto 5, because practically nothing works the same anymore. Like, the bolt release part way works the same, but only part way. But we'll get to that later. Essentially, the way this trigger group works is you've got your trigger, and it is opposed by a primary sear, and then it's got a disconnecting arm here that interacts with the primary sear. So pulling the trigger there rotates the primary sear here backwards. If we cock our hammer, we'll see that again. Pulling the trigger rotates the sear backwards. The hammer comes forwards. The hammer is driven by a plunger. The hammer plunger will push on this arm, which comes underneath the carrier, and it interacts with this disconnecting feature there on the sear. So if we pull the trigger, the sear will rotate backwards, the hammer comes forwards, the hammer plunger pushes on this arm, which lifts this arm, which pops the sear back into its original position. This is not a secondary sear-based system. It's not a Browning double hook, it's not anything like that. There is just one sear surface. So to show you that again, we pull the trigger, sear rotates backwards, hammer comes forward, the plunger will push on this arm, which pushes up on this arm, which resets the sear. Just to show you guys the sear reset, if you watch for it, right there at my pinky, as the hammer comes forward, boop, there you go. And that's your fire control group. Servicing the fire control group is pretty easy. It's just cross pins the whole way through, except for the carrier. It's held on by these couple of spring clips. These spring clips are actually what retains the fire control group pins. So you can't hate the spring clips too much, because of course the fire control group pins are awesome compared to having to do screws, but getting those spring clips off does suck. They're not meant to be taken on and off of there at will, but of course this whole unit really isn't meant to be serviced much at all. Like the Auto 5, right? Its fire control group isn't really meant to be taken apart, but this one's also got the carrier on it, and everything here is tons easier to manufacture. Remington was really onto something here, and I think you'll see it by a lot of shotguns. Like I don't want to say 80%, but it's probably pretty close to there, of autoloading shotguns, or really shotguns at all, that are in a regular form factor. I'm not talking about your Turkish bullpup shitters, but a lot of shotguns will take note of this and more or less do the same thing. I'll set that to the side now. Last thing we'll take out of this receiver before the bolt is this arm here. On the Auto 5, this arm is 4 parts, three parts really, but it requires 4 parts to be in the gun, but 3 parts do this part's job. Regularly in the Auto 5, this is the shell stop that's interrupted by the barrel. So it's your, I guess, left-hand side of the gun shell stop. Traditionally, this is a milled part that's got a pin and a spring. In this gun, it's just a stamped piece of steel. It's a little flexible. People didn't like this. They complained about this, but really it's a giant simplification. It's an example of what stamped steel can get you, because additionally the Auto 5 required a hole in the receiver to mount its version of this part. There's not an extra hole in the receiver. This thing mounts up with the fire control group hole. It's genius. It's very, very smart. If a little bit flimsy and cheap feeling, because this sure doesn't inspire confidence, although it does work great, and I don't think I've ever seen one of these break, despite the fact that it is a pretty wonky stamped shape going on there. Finally, to take the bolt out, charging handle is held on by a spring detent. Isn't that nifty? And the bolt just comes out of the gun. The Auto 5 sure wishes things could be that easy. The Auto 5 is substantially more complicated than that. Looking at the bolt, we have this is before the Ruger 1022, but I always call this a 1022 style extractor. It's a plunger that goes over a notch on the extractor claw. And the advantage there is that the extractor claw is not pinned into the gun. The extractor claw just has a round knob that sits inside of this hole you can see there, and then is retained by its own spring. Oh, it gives me tingles how cool that is, how smart that is. You can't get away with this on all guns because, of course, this allows for the extractor to have a little bit of front-back wiggle, but a little bit of up-down wiggle. Some guns won't let you get away with this, but long recoil, especially shotguns, totally will. So that's genius. The entire bolt group is held together by the firing pin, which is a little bit concerning, but of course, whenever the gun's in there on its rails, the firing pin's not, it's not trying to yank the bolt group apart. But it is a little concerning that the firing pin is what holds the entire system together. It's easy to get out, as we can show here. It's a little bit more tricky to get this to go back in later, but we'll also show off that. But just what I want to emphasize here is how this pin, the one time this pin's going to give me trouble is when I put it on camera. The thing that I want to emphasize here is exactly how easy it is to take this bolt group all the way apart. And, you know, if we wanted to go for the extractor, it's just taking a screwdriver and pushing the plunger back, but we'll leave the extractor in there for today. You have a breech block here and a sled here, as well as a locking block. That's sort of your three major components. The locking block is pinned on to this sled, which may seem a little bit unusual because this is your breech block, there's your breech face. Nothing actually physically locks this to the barrel. Like this is not, there's no pins through this. The locking block doesn't actually lock into this. So it may be a little bit confusing at first how this works, but if we see the locking block on the sled, the locking block will tilt up, and that sort of presents a flat face here. That flat face will reinforce behind the bolt face on the breech bolt itself there. So now you have the flat face, the two flat faces are lined up against each other, and because you're going to have spring pressure from the action spring on these tails pushing the sled, not the breech bolt, forward all the time, whenever this assembly is locked into the barrel, the sled will be pushed forward, and then whenever the gun fires and the assembly recoils backwards, the tendency will be for this entire assembly to stay locked. And that's how that actually then manages to work, despite the fact that the breech bolt itself is not physically constrained to the barrel. The only thing really constraining the breech bolt to the sled is the firing pin, also the receiver rails which guide the bolt and the barrel together is really doing most of that work. But this is a very interesting system that is a little bit sketchy looking at it outside of the gun, the fact that the breech bolt isn't actually held to the sled. Meanwhile, compared to an Auto 5 where the actual locking piece is like put on a hilariously machined slot through the bolt carrier itself. It's a much more rigid, strong looking system. This system does, of course, still work fine. And then just to give you guys an idea of how this works, whenever the gun fires and recoils backwards, the system will stay locked because it is long recoil. This notch here on the carrier dog will latch against that sort of notch cut out here. Sort of tricky to show, but they will latch together, which of course pulls the sled backwards and lets the barrel come forward. The barrel goes back to its original position. Whenever the barrel gets to its all the way forward position, it will kick this lever out of the way. And once that lever is kicked out of the way, that will release the carrier. And this cut, interfacing right there on the dog, which is tricky to show, but it'll be like that. Once this carrier is released, the shape of this dog, whenever it gets pushed downwards, and the bolt carrier now being released to go forwards, will pop up the carrier like so until the bolt carrier gets past it, when it will lay it down like that. It's a very, very cool way these three parts, I guess the sled, the carrier, and the dog work together. More or less the same as the Auto 5, but it's a little bit easier to show you here because it's all on one unit. Whereas on the Auto 5, the carrier is mounted to the receiver, and once it's in there, you can't really see how the magic's happening. So cool to be able to show you guys that here. Now, reassembling this unit is a little tricky. First off, because the bolt carrier tails have a left and a right hand part, that's a little confusing why they did this. I am not the biggest fan of them doing this. There we go, it goes like this. They certainly could have made these mirror image parts. I see no reason they couldn't have. Although probably they did it to make it so. Probably the action spring tube would need to be not perfectly straight if they made it so these arms weren't right there, because they're they're bent like this, but then they're also bent like this. So they're bent in two directions. Again, a stamped part. Oh, and of course, whenever you compare this to the the Auto 5's equivalent of this part, it's a rather hilariously milled, probably cast, but then milled part. Two rat tails is a lot simpler. Now the complexity of putting this bolt group back together comes with this pin, which retains the firing pin, and of course the firing pin holds the whole unit together. You have to get the firing pin lined up through all of the pieces of this assembly, as well as the firing pin spring. And the firing pin spring always wants to kink up on you, and the firing pin never wants to be able to find the hole in the front of the breech face. So this will typically take me a couple of tries to get just right. And then it helps if you get the locking block to stand up straight, which usually involves holding the whole assembly upside down so that a camera can't see it very well. But it also helps if you don't drop the spring on the floor. Okay, give this another try here. You have to push the pin back out. Get the locking wedge to come up. Pin out, locking wedge up. See if you can get the spring to go through. There's the spring going through. Get the pin back out. And now you just have to hope the firing pin's going to find its way through straight. It's currently not feeling like it will. Nope. All right. Feels like the spring's not lined up right. There, it's close. So now if we push our pin out, see if our firing pin can go forward. It cannot, which means the spring's kinked up. Spring didn't look kinked up, but that's just sort of how this process goes. I'm sure someone out there is a Remington 1148 whisperer, and they've just never had trouble putting a firing pin in, but for the life of me, I just struggle with it. There we go. Feels like it's close there. There it is. And there's your unit stuck back together. And of course, if you ever have the fun of putting one of these back together, be careful because that firing pin spring is heavy and you can launch a firing pin 30 feet across the room. But there it is. Our bolt assembly now gloriously reunited. We can begin to put the gun back together. Really the only thing to be aware of as you're reassembling is that there's sort of a false rail there in the receiver, and that exists for this arm on the stamp piece to sit inside. You can put the bolt group in cockeyed though, so you do have to avoid that. There we go. Got it put in not cockeyed. Retract it slightly. Stick our charging handle back in. There we go. Bolt group is reinstalled. We can now take our stamped piece here, sort of sneak it under the bolt. Sometimes you have to pull back the bolt just slightly to get it lined up just right. And of course, once we're underneath with the fire control group out, this stamped piece, of course, gets pushed over by the barrel whenever the barrel's all the way forward. And so this stamped piece can sort of act as the carrier stop. It stops the carrier from coming back up. But this stamped piece, also acts as a shell stop there. So if you had a shell in the magazine tube, you can sort of mock that up here. Maybe not because this shell is fired. It's not going to want to go in there nicely, but we'll show you whenever the gun's a little bit more put back together anyway, since I'm having to hold this with my finger. This does act as a shell stop as well whenever the bolt's forward. Now, the way this system then works, we'll see whenever the trigger group is back in, you don't have to push the button, and you don't have to have a two-piece lifter to load shells into the magazine. This is something that no other shotgun is going to pull off quite like this. I'm sure there's at least one other example of a shotgun that did do it, but the 1148 was first to it, and there's a lot of shotguns after the 1148 that confusingly didn't copy this system because it is really smart. But once the trigger group is back in, we'll be able to talk about it more. But what I want to show you is that whenever the bolt comes back, it depresses the shell latch, right? So the shell latch is going to be depressed right there. And then whenever the bolt gets back past it, it just disengages itself. So pay attention to that the bolt coming back, I guess whenever the bolt's forward, it holds the shell latch in its regular position, but the bolt coming backwards releases it. Just pay attention to that. So now we'll put the fire control group back down, or the receiver back down, try and stick the fire control group back in. The stamped piece makes this a little tricky sometimes because the stamped piece has to sit flat into a recess. Yep, it's gonna try and fight me a little bit. That's okay. There it is. Get our pair of pins. The rear pin usually goes right in. The front pin can be a little tricky. And then usually it's just tricky because this pin also has to get to that stamped piece of sheet metal, which is currently bound up on. Wiggle it just slightly backwards, see if it'll go. No, it will not. Ah, because I wiggled it too far. Maybe give it one of those numbers, and then it should go in. So, even when things don't go right, this is still way easier to deal with than an Auto 5. We'll take our recoil spring assembly next. Wiggle it on. Take our barrel. Lock the bolt back first. Take our barrel. And of course, the one thing to note on the barrel is that, of course, we've rounded off the barrel extension because the receiver is rounded off. The only part of the barrel that needs to come back that far is our ejector there on the barrel. Of course, that's just a milled tab because it doesn't need to be anything fancy because we're a long recoil gun. But stick the extension into the receiver and then line the lug on the barrel up. And then we can take the whole assembly into our lap like we're used to. Throw our handguard on. And it sure is nice having a metal reinforced handguard because you don't have to think about what happens if I drop it or whatever. You don't have to worry about it cracking anyway. And there we have it, our 1148 reassembled. Just to go over the function of it one more time because it is, to me, interesting because, again, in its course of redesigning practically everything, Remington did change how this gun works entirely. So we'll get our hyper-realistic snap caps here. Of course, pressing the bolt release closes the bolt. And regularly, it's the right side, the shell release, or bolt release, bolt stop, also the carrier stop, that gets depressed to let the carrier come up. However, whenever the bolt is forward, like we talked about, it's going to keep this bolt stop depressed. So now, we're able to put shells into the gun because the two carrier stops, the two things that stop the carrier from coming up, is the right side one, which interfaces with the bolt, and the left side one that gets pushed out of the way by the barrel. Because of this, we can just push a shell right into the magazine tube, like so. You don't have to fiddle with the button, don't have to do any of that. This is marvelous compared to the other shotguns we've talked about, where you have to hold buttons or nose a tab out of the way. Nuh-uh, none of that going on here. This system, pretty darn close to perfect. So there's that system. Of course, then going to rack a shell in there. Once the bolt comes backwards, both of the shell stops get pushed out of the way at that point. And then as the bolt comes forward, of course, you've got one chambered. There we go. It works differently than the Auto 5 in this regard. Its shell tendering is different. But of the shell tendering systems we've looked at so far, not only is this the most advanced, I think it's more advanced than most shotguns you can buy today. Either require holding a button or pushing a tab to get the gun to feed. Meanwhile, Remington did, they essentially Goldilocks it, right? Where it does all of the functions that you want the shotgun to do. And how many buttons are there? One. And how many times do you have to press it? Once. That's pretty freaking cool. It's genius, really. Extremely, extremely well-designed shotgun. And then confusing, I guess, because the reason the 1100 doesn't have as simple a system is because the 1100 isn't long recoil, and you kind of need the barrel to be able to move to give you that input of the barrel's all the way forward. This shell stop can be, or this carrier stop can be disabled. But there you have it. That's the Remington 1148 at a high level overview. We'll go ahead and do some shooting with this gun as well as with the 410. But first, I do want to show you guys the one difference that the 410 and 28 gauge guns have. I guess the first difference is they're 4-round capacity instead of 5. Sort of the more pertinent difference is that because 410 and 28 are awfully low recoil, we got no friction rings. Woohoo! It's just a really long, springy spring that you can beat your gun up with. That's really all there is to it, is a really long, springy spring on those. Now, I'll go ahead and get this put back together. We'll go and shoot it, and then we'll come back here for just some final thoughts on the 1148.
All right, now we're out here. It's a little bit of a cold day, but we have our Remington model 1148 12 gauge gun to start off with here. Anytime that I'm dealing with the shotgun, I can't help but remind myself of sort of the backstory of this gun. That this gun saw huge commercial success, especially in its follow-ons. Right? I can't help but reiterate. This gun gives birth to the 870, the 1100, and the Model 58 halfway along the way there. But the 58 becomes the 1100. Right? This gun is foundational to the rest of Remington's history when it comes to making shotguns. But loading it is pretty simple. And of course, I've run out of light loads for today, so we'll be running heavy loads through it. It is pretty grueling with heavy loads. The strange friction ring system, like sort of lack of a control ring in the friction ring system, does make it pretty brutal to shoot with heavy loads, but we'll go ahead and get through it. And like I mentioned, right, the loading, of course, the loading gate you don't have to push a button for, because the bolt actually pushes that button when it's forward, which is really cool. But the feeding it is a very crunchy, unrefined feeling system. And that's mostly just because you have a stamped steel piece that's your shell stop, instead of it being like a spring-loaded piece that's not much of a lever. You've got a very stiff shell retention. And so ramming the shells in there is really the way to do it. But then of course, if you've got big thumbs, you've got sharp edges at the front of the mag port waiting to give you a bad day. But as we sort of become accustomed to, we have a total of 4, not 5 in the tube and 1 in the chamber. We'll go ahead, blast a little bit of clay with it here, do a little bit of slow motion, and then get back to the table. But maybe along the way we'll spice in a little bit of the 410 shooting too, just because it is so cool. And as grueling as the recoil can be, it sure does shoot nice. It's smooth, it's reliable. I've of course had reliability problems with the Model 40, but I think of all my shells through this thing to date, I don't know that it's ever given me a single problem. And these guns will go through, like any of them that you find online, right? Most of the ones you find on Gunbroker are beat to shit. I was lucky to find this one at a reasonable price in utterly fantastic condition, aside from the ruts that in shipping they had put in that stock for me because they'd taken the barrel off to ship it separate and hadn't wrapped it very well. But I'm not too upset about that, because besides those marks, this is an excellent condition example of an 1148 12 gauge. Great shooting gun. One thing that did trip me up with this gun is I initially didn't like it because I couldn't hit anything with it, but it turns out right after patterning, of course, it's non-ribbed, so sometimes it can be unclear how high you're supposed to put things off of the top plane of the receiver. You aim along, and then you put the bead out on the barrel on top of it, is your typical sight picture. But because this one doesn't have a rib, you sort of have this mount, and that mount and bead float on top of the receiver together for a natural feeling sight picture. However, I couldn't hit anything with this gun, but it turns out it hits like, whenever we talk about shotgun patterns, like 80-20 means 80% of your shot pattern is above the bead, 20% is below. This gun's like a -10, 110. If you go to pattern it, none of the shot pattern is below the aiming plane whenever I aim that way. So it hits very, very high, which makes some sense, right? Because it's a full choke. But when you're going to shoot trap with this, you're going to be leaving 3 birds worth of daylight between your top bead and the target. It's a very interesting thing. I'm not sure if all the 1148 12 gauges come out that way. I've got a different barrel that's a skeet barrel that doesn't do that, but it's also got one of the Cuts combo chokes on there. So maybe that's interfering with things somewhat there. But this thing does shoot hilariously high. Not sure if that was intentional, but it is, like you saw, right? It's entirely possible to use. It's just that it's so high that, and until I patterned the thing, I couldn't hit anything with it. But that's the 1148 and 12 gauge there. As far as I'm concerned, there is no such thing as too much Remington 1148. I can't say that I like it better than the Auto 5 because the fit and finish on the 48s is just not as good. But man, I really want to be able to say that. I badly want to be able to say that, but it's just not true. But the 1148s have charm. They've got vigor, they're reliable, they're durable. They're a little tricky to find parts for, at least especially with the 410 gauge here, but it's just a barrel full of monkeys. Specifically this 410 gauge, I don't know if I can emphasize enough how fun this stupid gun is. It is a crying shame that these are so expensive. Right prior to the internet, right in the 90s, the 48s and 410 were worth nothing. They were the sort of the least desirable ones. And of course, once everybody learns that an automatic 410 gauge that doesn't suck, these things became worth way too much money. But it's a fantastic little gun. We got our skeet choke vent rip barrel on it today. We'll see if we can shoot a little bit of the clays with it and see if we can demonstrate the adage that, the 410 is the expert's gun. Because inside of 40 yards, pretty much every shot that you can make with a 12 you can make with a 410, assuming the 410 is choked right and you're using the right loads. It's a little bit more sensitive than that than 12 gauge is, but 410 out to 40 yards can hit anything that you're shooting at. You just have to do your part. And 410 will lay bare all of those defects in your training, those defects in your how you've learned to shoot a shotgun. Because you have, compared to 12 gauge, we've been shooting a lot of 1 ounce and ounce and an eighth today, half-ounce loads with 410 here. You have half the shot to do things with. And you'd think that means that, oh, your pattern is just half as sparse. But you remember that patterns are three-dimensional things, right? That in terms of timing the bird, as the bird's crossing across where your shot stream is, if your pattern's not just necessarily half as wide, it's also like half as long, right? It's not as long a sheet of lead coming at the bird. You'll sometimes see birds that break because they fly into the rear end of your shot stream, right? It does happen. But with 410, you don't really get as much of that going on. I know this is extreme gamer shotgun math, and most gamer shotgun math is just code that's made up because it's not real, because it's all probability anyway, right? But 410 is, point of that gigantic sidetrack there is, 410 is much harder to hit stuff with, but much more rewarding when you do it. And it doesn't beat you up, so you can miss a lot more. And that's sort of the fun there of 410. Anyway, we'll go ahead, blast a couple of these clays if I do my part, and then get some slow-mo footage of this guy, and then send you guys back to the table. my foot was still on the pedal to throw him there. This thing is just so hilariously easy to shoot. Especially after you've been shooting a 1148 and 410, or 12 gauge rather, with heavy loads. 1148 and 410 is just a barrel full of monkeys. All right, run our last shell here. Put another one in there, because I think we got 2 more birds that'll go out of that thrower. I'm gonna try both of these with one hand, so no support hand on the gun, just to show you guys. The 410 is really easy to shoot. We had a bird that broke out of the thrower there. Go ahead and top this back up. We only have one more bird in the machine that'll go. We'll see if we can do that one. I mean, it doesn't get easier than that. Yeah, I'm sure somebody could probably do that with 12 gauge if you gave them enough tries, but it doesn't hurt when you do it with 410. And that's sort of a magical thing all on its own. That's the Remington 1148 410. I'm in love with this gun, if you can't tell.
So there we have it. That's the Remington 1148. It's a truly fantastic shotgun that, of course, Remington did make cheaper. And I don't want to say cheap because they are rugged, they are durable, they are reliable, and unfortunately most of the ones you find have had a hard life. They did not retain their value like Auto 5s retained their value. These days these things are cheap, and because they're cheap, they've been used as truck guns, as backup hunting guns, as backup hunting guns, as tent poles, as paddles. Whenever you lost the paddle in your hunting boat, you go use the 1148 because it's the cheap one, I guess. A lot of the guns you find these days are in pretty poor shape. But they are wonderful shooters, parts are relatively available, and I think they are rather underappreciated. Not only for how good of a shotgun they are, because frankly I think they're great. I think the loading system is the smartest. The shell tendering system is fantastic. Really simple, easy to take apart, easy to maintain, but also because they are foundational to the rest of autoloading shotgun history. Of course, we'll look at some other shotguns in the next couple of videos that were very contemporaneous with the 1148. Because of course the 1148 there at the end of World War II, right? A, big war just ended, but also B, the model, the Auto 5's patents have all expired at this point. So you sort of have that double whammy of things lining up in time. So you're going to see a lot of other shotguns sort of spring onto the scene around the same time. But when it comes to conceptual ideas that were packed into the thing, I think the 1148 came the closest to addressing what it is the public was concerned about. And certainly the fact that it sold better than any of the other ones that were contemporaneous with it probably bears that out. But it also managed to capture them in a way where Remington took this same basic frame, the same basic design, and mature it again and again and again, and it becomes their mainstay until they end up going bankrupt for reasons unrelated to their shotguns, because their shotgun thing was one of the few profitable things they were still engaged in whenever the company went under. The 1100 was a fantastic shotgun until they, of course, it's until Vista, the Freedom Group, Vista Outdoors, bought them out, that their quality took a nosedive because the brand was essentially just shelled. I'm complaining because I am kind of team Big Green. I do like Remington a lot, especially for what they did for the autoloading shotguns, because this was fantastic. And the amount of money that Remington made on this gun was what enabled them to go and invest in the 1100 the way they did. Of course, the 1100 is touted as one of the first guns that was designed with computers, because they used computers to analyze things like gas pressure in the gas system. They used computers to measure recoil, to tune the springs in the gun. They made heavy reliance of those things that, these days even, gun designers don't go and put that much effort into making the gun perfect. Meanwhile, Remington was so ahead of the game that they had their opportunity, and boy did they seize it, because they remained dominant for a long time to come. During this time, Winchester would start making automatic shotguns that would work pretty well, but nowhere near as what Remington was doing. Remington would remain king for a long time to come until Italian companies would eventually manage to dethrone it. The shotgun we'll be looking at next time is an Italian shotgun. It didn't dethrone the 1148 or Remington at all, but it did keep this company in business for quite some time. And that'll sort of be the focus of that video. Is we're going to enter, so thus far it's just been the Belgians making an American gun and American guns. Eventually, here at the end of World War II, with Italy in need of money because it turns out they picked the wrong side, but we're sorry about that, Italy would break up its big national arms factories and become very interested in civilian arms manufacture for the US market. Several different Italian companies will end up making long recoil shotguns. We're going to look at all of those, but of course the next one we're going to look at was very contemporaneous with the 1148. I've been trying to dig into the history of both of them, and so far as I've been able to research, the history that I'm telling you guys is the true and current version, but I reserve the right to come back and have to amend this, because this shotgun was extremely contemporaneous with one Italian offering, and they did a lot of things very similar. So one of the two of them saw each other, although the information that I've seen tells me that Remington had the 1148 in development for some time, and that it was probably the Italians copying the Americans and not the other way around. But I guess that just goes to show I'm learning these things as you guys are learning them. It's sort of a lot of information that isn't well documented, which is sort of why I wanted to go through and do some of this, was to learn more about the guns and a little bit about their history, a little bit about their background, but also just, of course, the way they work, because that's also very, very interesting. But here you guys go. It's the 1148. There's not a lot to say besides what I've said. It's a good gun. I think they're underappreciated. I think they're undervalued, frankly, although a lot of the ones you find are beat up. Even still, It's a really good gun. It's probably the first of the Auto 5s that I could recommend, because the Model 11s are overpriced for what they are, because, you know, they're the Auto 5, if you will. Auto 5s themselves tend to be pretty expensive. These are a good value, though, for when you can find them in good shape. Pretty good value. I like them a lot. Not the 410s specifically. The 410s are hilariously overpriced. But if we pull our 12 gauge example back out for a moment, the 12 gauge guns you can find very good deals on. But that's the 1148. It completely redesigned the Auto 5, practically only in good ways. I think everything they changed was really a change for the better. Either a market force was demanding it, so they needed to change it to sell it, or it was just straight up a good idea, like the bolt group being redesigned. It was long overdue for as complex as it was with the Auto 5. However, these Italian companies I mentioned, they'd throw their hats in the rings to try and find other ways to make things simpler as well. And over the course of the rest of the videos, we will look at an awful lot of Italian shotguns. But for now, this is sort of at least for now, that's the last hurrah from Remington, because Remington would stop making long recoil shotguns after the 1148. After we've looked at the Italian guns, we'll probably back up just a little bit to look at a couple of American offerings, because during this whole time, right, Savage had licensed manufacture of the Model 11 from Remington. So Savage made the 720, which was just a clone of the Model 11. We will go back and look at the Savages at some point, I promise, but they're not a very direct lineage, because Savage made those, they made one follow-up, and then they just knocked it off and nobody ever bothered to copy what they were doing. It's more or less an island of development. We will, or peninsula is more accurate. It's a peninsula of development. We will go back and look at it, but since I've seen a couple of people asking in the comments, you know, what about the Savages? We will get to those in due course. But for now, 1148, look at Italian shotguns next time. If you guys have found any of this interesting or whatever, you can go to the Patreon and the cope, between the cope section. The cope section is where you go and type about how easy it is you can put in a firing pin in 1148. I'm sure I'm just the worst at it and you're really good. You can go to the cope section and tell me all about your firing pins. But above the cope section, but below the video, there's a section where you can go to the Patreon if you want to give me monies to talk about shotguns more. Or of course, there's also, you know, the content that YouTube doesn't like interspersed there. But I like the shotgun stuff a lot too. It's not just YouTube. Maybe YouTube's based because they let you do shotguns and they like it. That's probably not true. They don't like shotguns either. But anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed. I hope you guys check out the Patreon. But if you don't, you can leave an angry comment in the comment section, because it does an algorithm. And I will see you guys next time where we talk about Italian shotgun.